So the election is over and the aftermath goes on, but more importantly, what effect does that have on you? What effect does it have on the real estate industry and our desire to build wealth and income through real estate? I'm Bill Gross at Bill Gross Probate. We're going to get into not political nonsense, but really go look at the facts of what changes will be as a result of the changes in the recent election. But before we get into that, we have to take a look at where the numbers are so we can make an effective analysis of where we're going to be going. And in an economy, you just have two parts. You have the demand and supply. Demand would be indicated in real estate by interest rates and how many buyers are ready to buy houses. And supply would be inventory and how many houses are available for sale. Let's take a look at those two numbers as we start our analysis. On the interest rate side, fascinating reality. Rates post-election, they had gone from 6.15 before the election. We're told about how the Fed was lowering rates. And as soon as the election got closer, the Fed, I think, couldn't keep their thumb on the scale long enough. And they jumped back up to 7% right before the election. And then I think, I'm not sure what the decision was, but after the election, it was clear that the Republicans had a huge victory. They dropped back slightly. I don't make a big deal of it, but it is below 7%. So we had this charge up of 1% that's reverse course, at least for now. We're kind of in the middle of where we've been for the last couple of years. Rates are by historic standards high. If inflation is only 3%, then a 7% mortgage rate is extremely high, going to be a problem for buyers going forward. But for now, there's so little homes that we won't see home prices drop. And we'll get into that as we get into the inventory side of things. Now, the inventory, for those of you who watch me, I'm changing my source of information from the prior company to using Redfin. And if you follow me, I hate Redfin. They're a company that promises, I'm looking for the numbers, I'm sorry. I'm looking for the number, Redfin is one of those companies that wants to disrupt the economy, but they don't pay any income taxes. They're one of those Wall Street monopolies that takes wealthy people's money, destroys other businesses, and hopes to make them wealthy while being worse for the economy. And in Redfin's case, never paying federal or state income taxes in California. However, they do have data online. There's great data, and so we're going to go ahead and use it since we're basically paying for that by subsidizing their existence. If you look at the data, you'll notice that inventory is coming down, which it does almost every year this time of year. But even though inventory is higher than it was, let's say, in January, other than the pandemic period, it's at an all-time low. And so we still have not adjusted to kind of the new reality. You see inventory have been kind of slowly reducing over time, but still the numbers we have are below anything pre-pandemic. And so we have still an artificial economy that has not responded to the changes. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, what I do know is as long as there's a little inventory, you can have a crash in prices because the only way prices go down is if there's too many people bidding on those properties. Too many people selling properties, not enough buying it, and then the price goes down. And that's clearly not the case. So I'm not sure where we're headed, but one thing I can say for sure is as of right now, unless something dramatic changes, we're not heading for any kind of housing crash. Now, real estate is local in Los Angeles. I use Altos Research, and they give an overall rating. They look at all the factors in the economy for the real estate and then give a factor of 36, which is slightly a seller's market. We've been going from 42, 41, 40, 39, 37, down to 36. And we've remained a slight seller's market even still. And I see that as a listing agent, I still see more offers than we have properties for sale. So overall, the market in Los Angeles remains healthy for whatever that means in this post-pandemic world. Not quite sure, but we will find out. Okay, so let's get into the topic I talked about up front is the election, what effect did it have? One of the things I think that caused me to do this podcast is try to correct the misinformation. So for example, here's JP Morgan, which is really the private banker to Jeffrey Epstein and the pedophile trafficking ring. And they've paid hundreds of millions of dollars of fines being caught. They clearly would not want that information to come out. So they are really what you would call a party of the current administration. They're happy with the way things are, and they don't want any changes. And so their news is tainted by that. They did an analysis on what the impact of a potential Trump victory was. And I think if you read it, it's just hysterical. The conclusion, without any facts to support it, in my opinion, when I read this in detail, is that a Trump administration would be reflationary because they're maintaining that Trump would spend more money than the Biden administration did, hard to believe, and cause a modest headwind to economic growth. So they're actually saying that the Biden administration would have been spending less money and stronger for the economy. Now, you can debate that. I don't believe that their statistics in the report bear that out. And I think that they have their thumb on the scale because the last thing they want to do is be held accountable for their part of trafficking around the world. And we know that the many people in the Trump campaign team want to release the Epstein files so they get control of the Department of Justice. But let's get into details. Rather than kind of JP Morgan kind of, I think, putting out political propaganda, let's look at the actual numbers. So one of the things that came out last week was the Fed did cut rates by only by a quarter percent, by 25 basis points. You see the headlines though, but Trump's victory sows doubts about future moves. And the thing about this article so funny is on one hand, they say that inflation is low and will stay low, but they don't think the Fed will cut rates. Well, if rates are going to stay low, then that's what would cause the Fed to cut rates. They can afford to cut rates that are artificially high, historically high, if inflation is under control. The only reason why rates are higher than would be is concerns about inflation. But it doesn't seem like their article doesn't support that. But the headline has to be written by an editor who has to jab the Trump side because that's what most news do. 95% of journalists, and whether you like it or not, it's just a fact, 95% of them are Trump haters and would support and do their best to support the Biden administration. Now, what actually happened on the election? Let's take a look at actual results. So for example, in California, Proposition 33 failed. Not only did this attempt by the state to impose more rent control, which is another way of saying the state wanted to take the rights of property from the owners and put it in the hands of politicians in Sacramento. Not only did that fail, but the politicians are going to notice that anytime Californians vote on something like that, it gets their attention. They realize, I think, they've pushed the propositions of rent control too far statewide. So this is good. Overall, I would say this is good news for our economy, that the last thing we need are more stupid laws in California. You know, California has been, I think, the stupidest state. Now, this election, we actually stopped being the stupidest state. I think New York passed us by. New York actually, in addition to letting out criminals and then subsidizing criminals from around the world, that they then got a SWAT team to break into a man's house and take his pet squirrel and pet, I think, rat, and then kill them both. So they're going to attack and kill pets, but they let illegal migrants come in from around the world and actually give them money to stay here. So I think New York has taken back the "we're the stupidest state" flag from California, because California had a couple other, I think, positive developments in this election. Here's another one. Proposition 5 failed. Proposition 5 was going to make it easier for the state government to put propositions on to add bond measures, basically taxes on the citizens. And what we have here is legislators want to stay in power, but they also want more power, more money. And so rather than pass laws, what they've learned in California is be cowardly by creating a bond measure, lie about what the money goes for, and then blame the residents for approving the bond measure rather than realizing it was put on by the politicians, and the politicians finance the campaign and get what they want. And so they wanted to lower the number of voters who had to approve a bond measure, I think from 60 or 66% down to 55, and that went down in crushing defeat. And I think what's really exciting about that is when you look at who was it that led the charge against this bond measure. Number one, by far, California Association of Realtors, yay us. Second group, National Association of Realtors. And so you have basically real estate agents saying, hey, if you put more bonds on, it doesn't seem like it affects real estate, but people move out of state because the taxes are overwhelming. And that is what drove. And I'm not really big on overall the realtors' involvement in politics, but I have to say this was a case where they did a really good job. Another example, I think, of a bond measure passed in California that helps us as a state is passing Proposition 36. Now, if you know anything about California, you know we've just been destroyed by crime. because our government officials have both changed the laws to eliminate crimes. They pushed a proposition through to decriminalize stealing up to $951. And then we have local prosecutors who refuse to prosecute crimes and change the rules. And so here we have Proposition 36, which now has been passed to reverse a prior proposition to recriminalize stealing up to $951 and reclassifying as felonies, things that were felonies, crimes with guns and crimes with other weapons. And so here you have on one hand, our politicians crying about gun control. On the other hand, they basically eliminated penalties for criminals using guns. And so it took the citizens passing this proposition to put some teeth in the laws that we have on the books. Now you might say, what good does that do? We'll get in just a second, because there's no good law without good politicians enforce those laws. We'll get into that. But another example, I think, of bad laws statewide, like on the rent control, was the city of Norwalk this past week was sued by our state. And why? Because the state wants to force homeless shelters. And this is another example why the Prop 36 works out well, because you have a state, California, that wants to force citizens in Norwalk to live next to homeless shelters. Nobody wants to live next to them. Politicians want homeless shelters because it gives them the ability to spend money and reward their political friends. But nobody wants to live there. Governor Newsom announced a lawsuit from one of his mansions. He doesn't live near a homeless shelter. He wants you to, and calls it immoral that you don't want a homeless shelter next to your house. But we know that these homeless shelters bring all kinds of crime. And so that was another factor, was just the overwhelming impact of crime in California, and also the state forcing bad housing policy. Another example of the election, and I think this is a national result, is going to be the impact of the Department of Justice. You're probably familiar with the lawsuit, the NAR lawsuit that was settled, one judge, one jury, one lawsuit in one city. And you might think, well, how can that lawsuit affect the entire country? And the reality is the Department of Justice was backing that lawsuit with a sword to the throat of all of the real estate companies, forcing them into settlement. They've been chasing them for years. This started in the Obama administration, had been going on for years. When Trump came to office the first time, he stopped the Department of Justice meddling in this lawsuit. When the Biden administration came back into power, they reopened it and reinvigorated it. And the only reason I believe that these companies agreed to this lawsuit was the Department of Justice threatened antitrust violations against realtors as well. And again, this is a case of where the government can't stand real estate because most real estate is not regulated. We have Association of Realtors and MLS services. These are cooperative efforts, capitalism at its finest, to protect and service our customers. They want everything run through the state governments and the national governments. And so with the Trump administration, it's believed that he will go back to a policy of getting the Department of Justice out of this matter and allowing the free market to continue. So this is a big positive. Now, some of those settlements are already made, and they're before a judge waiting approval, and they may in fact end up getting approved. But I also think at the same time, you're going to see some of the companies who have not agreed to these lawsuits pull out of them, and as a result, not get the lawsuit, not continue the destruction of the real estate industry. Okay, one other great piece of news, and I lost it somewhere, is the loss by Hochman. Let me just get this pulled up real fast. I'm sorry about that. But this is another one of those things behind the paywall that I don't pay for, and I don't think you should need to pay for. Here we go. The real estate industry lauds the victory of a new district attorney in Los Angeles, Hochman. What's his first name? Nathan. And he beat George Gascon, who was a George Soros handpicked district attorney used to destroy a city. This has been going on throughout the country. We have in New York, San Francisco. And so what does this mean? This means that all people want is the enforcement of the laws. And we have these laws about, we decriminalized robbery and shoplifting, and it's just destroyed businesses and destroyed jobs. And you might say, well, why are realtors so interested in this? And the answer is because this is what real estate agents believe is causing people to leave our state. It's the crime, it's the lawlessness, it's the, when I go to Walgreens now, everything is behind plastic. I go to others, I was just in Miami, they don't live like that. We live in a world where there's less employees, we have more employees for security, we have less employees for service, and we have less ability to enjoy retail shopping experience because of the government's desire to allow criminals to run free. And so here in Los Angeles, we rose up and kicked out this district attorney, Gascon. He destroyed San Francisco, moved to LA, has hurt our city, and now has been removed. And I don't know that necessarily Nathan Hochman is the greatest district attorney, but at least he is not openly attacking our city. And I think that's an important distinction that we should have. People in Los Angeles just want to live their lives and not be attacked by their own lawlessness by the government officials. One other effect in the economy I think you'll notice is that these these drops in interest rates and Fed cuts are because the mortgage demand has dropped so much. Our real estate sales are in a free fall depression. Our sales numbers are down 30% from a few years ago. Mortgage demand is now down 41% despite the Fed cutting rates. You might say, why is that? And the answer is that overall, even though the Fed's cut rates, mortgage rates being high, about 7%, have not helped. And so overall, we need to have an economy that's healthy rather than the government trying to tweak things in order to find some way to solve the problem. The last example I think of, that's all the news from the election. But I think there was a great article came out last week that shows how our past efforts at solving homelessness have been just such an utter failure. And I think that's one of the things that drives this election was a desire to have less government involvement and more freedom for Americans to do business on their own. There was an article in the LA Times, which was republished by Yahoo News. And it describes in detail the utter failure, oops, I lost my spot there, the utter failure of the government attempt to create homeless shelters. And you see here a picture of exasperated residents cleaning up because the management isn't available. There was a portfolio of hundreds of units that had gone bankrupt, 17 buildings worth, $10 million worth of property that had been failing. And this new manager came in and bought it, and then he continues to fail. And they chronicle the reasons why, because for low-income housing, which ideally the rents are lower than average, they have to have more security because of the crime that goes on in homeless shelters. They have to have more cleanup expenses because people who are homeless don't take responsibility for the apartments that are given to them. They treat them like they're city streets, and they leave trash and they leave all kinds of problems to be cleaned up by the management. They're more expensive than luxury apartments to manage when you include the security and the cleanup costs and the other services that have to be provided to people who live there. And so what we've seen now is an utter failure of our government to solve problems. And I think the election, if you take Proposition 33's going down on rent control, 36 on pulling back some of the control on crime, I'm defeating 5 to pull the government out of using more bond measures to pay more power. And you combine it with this in-depth analysis on the failure of homeless shelters being run by the government, you'll see, I think the election, we may have hit a bottom where for the last 10, 20 years, we've had this nonstop movement towards more government involvement in real estate, more regulation, more spending, and the solution to every problem proposed being more taxes and more government programs and less the American dream, which is people working hard and buying on their own. And so I look at the outcome of the election in California, perhaps it's finally hitting bottom as being the stupidest state in the union. And perhaps a movement towards, at least in our state, tolerating the fact there'll be people who fail, but creating as much opportunity as possible for people to succeed. That's how I look at it. What do you see? So obviously I have some principles I stand by. I stand by freedom, capitalism, and the American dream. And if you don't, I appreciate we disagree. But what do you think? Share your ideas, your comments down below. If you like this, like it. If you don't unlike it, and hopefully you subscribe. You can find me on Bill Gross at Bill Gross Probate on social media, or BillGrossProbate.com is my website. And as always, hope you have a great day.